So let's jump right in then and get started. I'm John Cavanna, and I'm director of the Institute for Policy Studies, and welcome to all of you to this event, which is the third in an 8-part series that we're doing on the elections, different issues in the elections. This one, as you know, is on globalization and trade and the presidential election, and we will also obviously get into the financial crisis that's unfolding right now. And I'll just alert you that the next one is next Tuesday, October 28th at 12:30. It's on race and the election. It's called The Election and Post-Racial Politics. And there's just outside the door, there's a listing of all of these events, and I encourage you to check that out. Right after the election, Steve Cobble, who's here, who's an expert on elections, and Bill Fletcher and I will be talking about the elections. And in the past 2 years when we've done these, we haven't known who's won most of the elections when we've done these. So we're hoping this time that we know. Now, my job is just to moderate and to introduce the panelists. I wanted to make a couple of points, though, just in launching into this conversation. Then each of them will talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for a good conversation. So my 2 points. The first is, I've been thinking back over past elections, and it seems as though the moment that trade and globalization entered into the election dialogue in this country was 5 elections ago. It was the election of 1992. And the big issue was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It had been brought to us by the previous president, George Bush I. He had negotiated it, and it became a giant issue in the campaign. And really, for the first time, the global economy entered the campaign. Even though the U.S. has been thoroughly integrated in the global economy for over 30 years, and we have trade and investment and immigration flows and remittances and all of these other things that make us a very globalized economy, that was really the first time it came in. And it came in a big way. Bill Clinton actually gave entire speeches just about the North American Free Trade Agreement. And since then, globalization has entered each of the elections. It in particular comes in during primaries in the big manufacturing states. And in particular, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, you can be pretty sure that it's going to get big in those states. Just many of you will remember in the last election, 2004, John Kerry made the famous speech where he accused a number of big U.S. firms of being Benedict Arnold corporations, which required a huge historical leap for many Americans. But he was a guy who became a trader, and he called these companies traders, and he brought in the issue of the outsourcing of U.S. jobs, especially service jobs, to places like India, to call centers. And it was a big deal for a little bit. In this election, you will recall, we didn't really have a primary in Michigan. There was that's a different thing that happened, but there was Ohio, and there was Pennsylvania, and NAFTA came back. And we had a big debate over NAFTA. And Andy and Thea were very much part of that, and Sarah, and so we can get into that. But that's just an observation. I also want to say on a personal note that that first big fight, the one over NAFTA, was the one where I met Thea. She became a leading voice in the fight against the North American Free Trade Agreement. Sarah came to IPS in the middle of that, became a leading voice in the fight against the North American Free Trade Agreement. And Andy's group, the Citizens Trade Campaign, was born to help mobilize people in this country against unfair trade deals. So this panel has its birth in events of 1992. And then the second thing I just want to say is that obviously the global economy just fell into the lap of the campaign in the last 10 days with the global financial crisis. Although it's my observation that both candidates have largely decided to treat this as a domestic conversation. And it is true that crisis began more as a domestic crisis, but they have framed it, both of them, largely as a battle between Wall Street and Main Street, and have been much less. And here you have George Bush, who's just announced a giant, global financial summit on November 15th, and yet that still hasn't influenced a great deal the way this campaign is playing out. Certainly the financial crisis has, but less the global financial crisis. And that's something that I hope we get into. So I want to start, three people here who know a lot about this issue. First, we'll start with Andy Gussert. He is the director of the Citizens Trade Campaign. He comes out of doing, though, fair trade organizing in a state where this is a big debate, a lot of industrial workers, and that's Wisconsin. And so he brings to the conversation an awful lot of interaction with working people, ordinary Americans, about this issue and how it's affecting them. So we're going to start with Andy, and then Thea Lee is the policy director and the chief international economist at the AFL-CIO, and she's been working on these issues for, as I said, a long time. And then Sarah Anderson runs our global economy project here at IPS and has been in the middle of the debate around the bailout. So without further ado, we'll turn first to Andy. And it's great to see you all here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation and encourage people to grab chairs wherever you can. So Andy, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for holding this and talking about this issue. In the middle of this bailout, people really haven't been talking about what's been going on with trade at the level that reflects what's going on out in the States. So even though I'm here in Washington right now, more than 3/4 of the time I'm either traveling around the States or in Wisconsin talking with folks in those states about what's going on with trade. Just a brief thing about CTC, Citizens Trade Campaign. Most of our work is done in the States, in places like Oregon, Washington, Maine, Ohio, Wisconsin. And the way I explain it to my parents, who are very non-political, is a great way to explain it to anyone. When we get a farmer, the local Catholic priest, the peacenik, the environmental activist, and some labor people with a displaced worker walking into a congressional office, the congressman's shoulders just kind of slump down because they realize I've got everybody on the left here from the faith, farm, environmental, labor communities, as well as consumer groups or whoever else is in that district, and that it represents this cross-sectoral group of people, that this isn't just about one issue, it's about issues all the way across the board, and that's what makes members of Congress pay attention. So in places like Minnesota, we have 64, 65 groups that make up the state coalition, and in most of our states it's 30 or more. So that's the kind of power of bringing all of those folks together. It's instructive to know that as we talk about what happened in 2008 that brings us to today. Today, some folks sent me some ads and said, here's 5 more ads that are running in congressional districts on trade issues. And it was ads 98 through 103 this cycle. So we went over 100 separate ads in probably 70 or so congressional campaigns, including a handful of Republicans, that are running on this trade issue. And in places like North Carolina with Hagan against Dole, or places like Oregon with Merkley against Smith, it's become the singular issue defining the differences between the candidates. So it looks like it could shape up again this year to look like it did in 2006, where a whole bunch of people ran on the trade issue and surprisingly won. And that when you look at the ones who just ran against Iraq or just ran on one other issue but didn't bring up trade, they didn't necessarily win. It was one of the definitive issues of 2006. But to back up and see how we got to 100+ ads today, you almost have to go back to a year ago where you had the Peru trade agreement coming up. It was, people were kind of not sure where we're at, what are we going to do? There was some conflict. And you come out of that, and you have people with different viewpoints on where we're at across the board, across Congress. Even though you had a majority of Democrats voting against it in the House, you still had a number of Democrats going, where are we at? Where's the future of trade? And then George Bush did something that none of us in this room or none of them on the left could possibly do. He unified everybody by coming out with Colombia. And he said, we need to pass Colombia's FTA. We need to make this a top priority. And people all came together and said, whatever you might think about past agreements or whatever happened, they all unified in the states. So there was less cognitive dissonance at the local level. And people were able to work together starting in January, February, March, and really come out working together against the Colombia FTA for a whole host of different reasons. The other major, and I think it's worth noting, why did he do that? Did he really want to pass the Colombia FTA? Was this really the top priority? I used to be a fundraiser, unfortunately, for political campaigns. And the cynic in me said, this is the best issue for him to run with from now, the Bush administration, from now until this week, when he came out just the other day about it, that his role in this campaign has been to generate large amounts of money from the base whenever he can. And I think Colombia was a great example for him to do that, because he picked one of the most difficult places in the world to try and pass a trade agreement for a whole host of reasons, and lined everybody on one side up against everybody on the other. And I think it was pure Rovian politics, where you do it for money and you do it to attack what's weak and focus on, your weakness as a strength. And they've really tried to come out and do that. Then in the backdrop of this starting to happen during January, February, March, you had presidential primaries. So in Wisconsin, for example, we had a tough primary. We didn't know if it was going to be Obama or Clinton. People on the left on both sides are going different directions. It's like the Civil War, people fighting against each other in their same families. And we were able to get a number, the Farmers Union, the Wisconsin Farmers Union, the David Newby, who is from the AFL-CIO and a leader in trade issues and the state federation president there, a number of faith folks, to call up each of the campaigns and say, we want you to fill out this incredibly detailed questionnaire. And that questionnaire asked things about rolling back investor rights. It talked about a new way to do trade promotional authority, to give Congress more power and to have more transparency. It was really down in the weeds kind of stuff and very detailed. And of course, the presidential candidates did not want to fill this out. And when you had a number of these people unified, from everything from Sierra Club to the local person you have to talk to in Milwaukee if you want support of the African American community, all saying, we will not do this unless you fill out these questionnaires. We got them filled out like 3 days ahead of time. But it took someone writing a press release that says hot air blows through Wisconsin on a cold winter day as candidates come in and talk about trade and do nothing. So once that kind of was leaked out, that this was going to be the message about both campaigns, that they're all talking about trade, they're going to the Janesville plant, they're, huffing and puffing, but when it comes down to serious commitments, they won't make those commitments. They filled them out. And then we did what any good activist should do. We moved the goalpost. So for Ohio, we wrote a different questionnaire with more difficult questions. And we did it for Texas. And we did it for Pennsylvania. And we did it for Oregon. Now, we haven't put out a lot of press releases about this because, frankly, I don't think this is the issue. We don't want to talk about how extreme some of these commitments are. But I will tell you, if a year ago I was sitting here, or 2 years ago, telling you the types of commitments these people would make and that 100 ads would be running on trade, you would say I'm pie-in-the-sky crazy. So those are all up at our website at citizenstrade.org.positions. And you can also link to it from the front. But it has each of these questionnaires. And as much as I like to come here and take credit for it, it's really because you have a bunch of local people in the state asking the campaign at the same time. And you have some critical mass where the director of that campaign says to the director of the national campaign, we can't get the job done in Ohio for you, in Texas for you. We can't meet the goals in Pennsylvania unless you fill out this questionnaire. I'm getting calls from the head of the AFL-CIO, the head of the Sierra Club, and they go on and on. So it took a lot of work from a lot of people on the ground at that pivotal moment when you have leverage to get this done. And there was frankly, a lot of questionnaires that didn't get filled out. Same with the congressional level. But those commitments and the moving of the goalpost to refine down into what some of these positions are, put us in a position where we have a presidential nominee. And frankly, if it would have been Hillary Clinton, we could say the same thing. We have a presidential nominee that has made more substantial commitments and said more about trade and in a progressive way than we've ever had before. Then you move from that to releasing the Trade Act in June of, which is largely a roadmap to say here's what we're for in trade. So we don't have this this idea that we're only against things. So the Trade Act, introduced by Sherrod Brown and Mike Michaud, kind of gives a roadmap of here's what we support in trade. And we have somewhere between 70 and 80 co-sponsors for that in the House and Senate right now. So you have a lot of your trade champions coming out with that. And then you go into the platform battle. And Thea could probably speak to this a lot more because she was at the table and doing the hard work of making the things show up in there. But just to give you, a basic number, 57 pages, the final DNC platform, there was over 3,000 words on trade and globalization across 24 different individual pages. So it was littered throughout. And people have a tendency to poo-poo platforms or say, this isn't really that important, or come on, who really cares? But this is the policy position that's the starting point for anyone who should be running for office under that party. For them to be embracing fair trade principles, the principles that many people here have been fighting for since 1992, and say this is the official language of our party, when 2 years ago you would never see this in the talking points. You would never see this. DNC sends out these forms that are really just fundraisers. Tell us what you believe. And they have 17 different items, and you're supposed to check what you care about and send it back with a check. Many of you have probably got this. Trade and globalization is not on the 17 issues. Yet it becomes, with Thea and a whole bunch of other people's hard work, there's some really powerful language. I have like 15 things from there that you go, wow, that's in the platform. 2 of them will stop government from protecting the... we promise no future bilateral agreements that will stop the government from protecting environment, food safety, or the health of its citizens. And this is actual language. That we won't have anything that will give greater rights to foreign investors than U.S. investors. We won't allow anything that requires privatization of vital public services or prevents developing country governments from adopting humanitarian licensing policies. There's another one. We promise to enforce trade laws that safeguard workers and farmers from unfair trade practices, including currency manipulation, lax consumer standards, illegal subsidies, violations of workers' rights, and environmental standards. And there's more and more of that. And I think when you go through it and see this down-in-the-weeds policy language on trade, it means people in the Obama administration understand this, that doesn't happen unless they understand it's going forward, and that we're in a new place. And we're in a place where members of Congress can run on our issue because it does represent a majority of the people across the country. Let me just finish up by saying, there's a lot of polling that's been out. My favorite one is actually from a year ago this month that came out, I believe, in the Wall Street Journal that said Republicans are strongly against the current free trade model, which scared the hell out of a bunch of candidates, coming up that needed to run on free trade. I'm sorry. Republicans are against the current free trade model. So all these people who've embraced this because they've been told to are saying, wow, my people, like when you do the crosstabs, the self-identifying Republicans don't even believe in free trade. This is a problem. And from that, we saw poll after poll after poll that reflected the majority view of people in this country is they want reform. And that showed itself in the 100-plus ads. We've listed all this on our website, but let me just give you some of the more interesting things that we've seen over and over in these ads. The candidate, my opponent, opposes or casts the deciding vote on CAFTA. That's a big one that's coming up in maybe a dozen-plus ads. And he cast...
Well, people cast the
Yeah, well, and you really have to do some fun, tricky math to get there. But, like, my opponent cast the deciding vote to pass, this job-killing trade deal and sides with George Bush on trade policies that move jobs overseas. I will oppose job-killing trade deals, and I think that's a Sherrod Brown phrase that everybody's kind of picked up, like NAFTA and CAFTA, which cost our state, insert here, how many jobs. So, 22,000 in Maine or, 75,000 in Wisconsin, whatever that number might be. My opponent voted for tax giveaways to companies that move jobs overseas. I will support a Made in America tax break to keep jobs right here. My opponent voted for unfair trade deals like CAFTA that cost us jobs. But I think even more interesting is the nuance. You got to do this in 30 seconds, right? This isn't the really tough parts of trade. This is the rhetoric. But to see the DCCC and the DSCC embrace this type of language and run dozens of ads on their own, including like 2 or 3 more every other day, that are going up on trade when 2 years ago, 4 years ago, they wouldn't allow these types of talking points to go out in their background memos. That's where we came from. My former roommate ran in a 3-way primary for Congress and would send me the Rahm Emanuel talking points from the DCCC. And there was nothing in there about fair trade policies in 2006. So we're really in a different place here right now. And I think really we can talk more about this later if people want to, but I think the really interesting question is, when we have this wave of candidates getting elected, and they're all running on trade, and we're tracking that, and it's working, how do we hold them accountable in a real way? How do we say that, okay, you ran on this, but here's what it means? And how do we use the financial crisis and other things that are happening to say, here's how we have a chance to restructure and do what's right? And I think those are like 2 or 3 of the big challenges we have. With that, I hand it over, and if people have questions, I can ask later.
Thanks a lot, Andy. So next to Thea Lee from the AFL-CIO, who I failed to mention was also on the Democratic Party Platform Committee.
Thank you, John. And thanks, Andy and Sarah. It's great to be here with my old friends talking about this issue, and in a moment when I think everybody's feeling a little bit optimistic that this won't be a futile discussion as it has been in past years when we've talked about what we would do if we were in charge and then we never get to be in charge. But so I wanted to talk a little bit about what an Obama administration is likely to do, and I want to make it clear that I'm speaking from my own personal imagination and optimism, as opposed to, I'm not an official spokesperson, obviously, for the Obama campaign. But here in D.C., everybody is obsessed with this question, will a candidate be protectionist or free trader? And it's sort of a stupid question. It's always been a stupid question. But I think in 2008, it's even more clear why that is not a meaningful distinction to make between the candidates, and that the choices that we have, and I think this is the whole point about the campaign and the way trade plays in, we don't have a binary choice, yes or no. Are we going to trade or not going to trade? We all understand that. We're all grown-ups here. We're in a global economy. We're very firmly entrenched in a global economy. The question is, how can we navigate the global economy better than we have? And what are our objectives? And I would argue to you, and I think everybody here probably agrees with this, is that what's been wrong with trade policy for so many decades is that we've had a single objective, which is let's help multinational corporations make more money by improving their flexibility, their mobility, and their freedom from government regulation. And that's what global trade rules are about. And then we cloak that all in the rhetoric of free trade, which is a phony rhetoric. So you put those 2 words and then you invoke, the whole body of economics to say everybody who's not an idiot understands that free trade is good for everybody in all circumstances. Why don't you? And this is my life in Washington, is to be the economist that flunked Econ 101. That I must have been absent the day that they did free trade, because I've been a critic of current trade policy and trying to convince folks that we have a different set of options, and that we're trying to figure out how we can have a trade policy that is good for working people, good for the environment, good for democracy, and good for development, as opposed to one that just says, well, whatever the companies do, if they're making money, eventually it'll work out for us. But Andy talked about the coalitions that we've built over the last 20 years or so to work on this issue. And what's interesting, of course, all the groups that Andy talked about, the left-wing coalition of labor, environment, human rights, faith-based groups, development groups. But also, I think what's important, and Jacques Nash is here, is the idea that it's also about domestic business and domestic farmers, that we have a domestic coalition where the people, those of us who need to figure out how to survive in a global economy and do so on American soil, have a lot of common interests, and that the policies of the Bush administration, and to some extent the Clinton administration before that, were not focused on keeping good jobs at home, and they were bad for some segments of the business community. And it's taken us a little while to figure that out, and I think it's partly because a lot of the business groups have their own trade associations, like the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, and the Business Roundtable that speak for them. And I think it took a lot of the small businesses and the domestic manufacturers a little bit of time to figure out that they were getting sold down the river by the trade associations that they pay dues to. And some of them have split off, and particularly on issues like taxation and currency manipulation, we've been able to form a coalition. We've worked together on a whole bunch of different issues, and it makes some difference. And I always say about labor, we can't outsource ourselves. We live here. We have to make a living on American soil. We have to figure out how to make that work. So the fact that some company is making higher profits by moving production offshore may be good for the CEO and the stockholders of that corporation, but it really doesn't do much for our communities, and it certainly doesn't do anything for my members. So I think I'm very optimistic that an Obama administration, and I'm assuming a stronger Democratic working family majority in both the Senate and the House as well, will create a force that will allow us to do some pretty deep reforms, not just in trade policy, but in the whole national policy that goes along with a trade policy as well. And I think that's one of the things that I thought was important about the Democratic platform, was that the idea is that trade policy is part of your domestic policy, that you have to have an integrated, coherent, strategic way of thinking about your national priorities and your international priorities, and that's been missing in the past. So the current policy is not working well on two fronts. One is the U.S. front, jobs, the trade deficit, competitiveness, and the second is development and inequality. And I think both of those are obviously related to each other, that if we have trade policies in place that increase inequality and violate workers' rights in the rest of the world, we're not going to have a good market for our stuff. We're not going to have people to sell to. If we destroy the middle class and keep workers on the edge of poverty and subsistence, then we're going to end up with the same kind of policy. If you think about two ways of thinking about trade policy, one is that we make the stuff, somebody else buys it. And if they're not going to be buying it, if the workers in other countries aren't going to be buying the stuff, we really don't care if they earn a living wage or they can form a union or they have a vote or not. It's irrelevant to us. We want them to be as cheap as possible so we can get cheap stuff. And the other way is to think about a more reciprocal trade relationship, which is one where we sell stuff to you, you sell stuff to us, but we have an interest in your standard of living rising in a coherent way. And to come back to the financial crisis briefly, and I know Sarah's going to talk more about this, and that's important. So if you look back at what the impact of our current trade policy has been on the U.S. economy, we have a $700 billion trade deficit, around 5 or 6% of GDP. We've lost about 3 million manufacturing jobs over the last 8 years, not all of them to trade, but a big chunk of them, I'd say somewhere around half. Some of them are lost to productivity gains and technology. But, and we've looked at this, and I know there are different ways of slicing it, but we think about half. And then almost more important than the job losses is the stagnation of wages over about 20 years. So we have a long-term slide in living standards for American workers, and there's really no question that when you put American workers into much more direct competition with workers in the rest of the world whose basic human rights aren't respected, that's going to drag down wages for American workers. And in fact, that's the goal. The goal is to keep wages cheap, to keep inflation down, to dampen wage gains, to shift the balance of bargaining power in the global economy from workers to capital. So if you make capital mobile and labor immobile, and then you allow companies to bust unions wherever they go, then it's not surprising that the result would be increasing wage inequality. But the end of that is that we end up borrowing a lot from the rest of the world. We borrow about $700 or $800 billion a year from the rest of the world to fund consumption of things that we no longer produce. And so we go further and further into debt. And a lot of people have said, and you've heard this, that China is our banker. China owns about $1 trillion worth of financial goods, and that means that we can't challenge China or the Chinese government over the trade relationship. But it's kind of a backwards way of looking at it, because the point is that our borrowing from the rest of the world did keep interest rates low and did keep inflation low for a while, but it came at a cost, which was that we were ceding our own productive base. And if you think about the financial crisis and you step back from it for just a minute, I'm going to oversimplify a little bit, but the idea is that for many, many years, not just this year, I mean, the financial crisis hit this year and all hell broke loose and the financial sector fell apart, but that we've been talking about this for a long time, that you can't actually build a successful consumer economy, a consumer-driven economy on the basis of debt and low wages and cheap imports. That works in the short run, and in the short run it feels good. You're buying stuff. It's like you've got a closet full of shoes that you buy on your credit card, and while you're buying the shoes, you feel great because you've got lots of nice shoes. But at the end of the day, if you're not making something and selling something yourself, then you're going to end up losing your house as well as the shoes. And that's kind of where we are, that we borrowed from the rest of the world to fund consumption that we weren't able to produce. I'm going to speed it up. So the key point that the current policy isn't working is really what the NAFTA debate in the primaries was about. When candidates say NAFTA was a mistake, it's a code word for them saying, okay, I understand our trade policy hasn't worked well. What they're going to do about NAFTA is a little bit of a harder question, and we can come back to that in the Q&A. But the second piece is that reform is possible without ending our engagement in the global economy. And we have to do two things. One is the investment at home, and that's what I think is really important, partly about the Obama economic program, and that we need to hold all the candidates at every level accountable for the promises they make. But the idea that a big part of that plan is to invest in America, in infrastructure, in clean energy, in education, and skills. Those are big investments that create jobs directly, but they also build the competitiveness of the U.S. economy. And we haven't made those investments in America for a long time because it hasn't been part of our strategy. Our national strategy is to move the jobs offshore when we're having trouble competing in the global economy. If we want to be able to move the jobs back home, we have to build the infrastructure, the technology, and the workforce that can do that effectively. And that's also part of an economic stimulus package. The other piece is the Employee Free Choice Act. I'll just make a big plug for that. The Employee Free Choice Act is the first major national labor law reform bill that we've had on the table in many decades, would make it a lot easier for workers to form a union and help rebuild the middle class. So those things are a crucial piece of rebuilding a domestic consumer economy that is globally competitive. And if you stop for 2 seconds, I'm just going to go back and say, people sometimes are very defeatist about the U.S. and the global economy. They just say, well, we're a rich country. Of course we're not going to be able to compete with China or any other country. So we may as well just give up and let the jobs go and buy the cheap stuff. And if you look at Europe, on the other hand, Western Europe in particular, that is a model of a very high-wage, high-tech, successful global economy where Europe just increased its manufacturing trade surplus from 2000 to 2007 at a time that we are losing out. And so the difference is really between a high-road global strategy and a low-road global strategy. And I would argue to you, for a country like the United States, if we try to win the low-road strategy, which is we're going to compete by keeping wages low and trashing our environment and cutting taxes, we will lose. And it's not a contest you want to win. But if you compete, on the other hand, by investing in your workforce and technology and trying to make just-in-time products, high-tech, and to do that, to compete in the high road, you actually need unions. You need strong unions, because the whole point is that companies shouldn't be wasting all their time and all their energy fighting with their workforce. They should be in partnership with their workforce to produce goods more quickly and more effectively and more productively, with lower turnover, with better apprenticeship programs, better training programs, and all those things come with the union. So I think President Obama will have a lot of work to do. I mean, he's talked a lot about ending the tax breaks for companies that offshore jobs. As John said, that's sort of an easy part. That's something that John Kerry has said people have been talking about for a long time. A lot of Democratic candidates ran on in 2006, but it's very popular and it's a good thing to do. And he also has talked about creating tax incentives through the Patriot Act it's not the Patriot Act, it's the Patriot Employer Act, which is something that Senator Obama has supported, that would create positive incentives for companies that created good jobs, good union jobs in the United States, give them procurement advantages as well as tax breaks and so on. The second thing is on enforcement and capacity building, which is kind of the dull part of the trade agenda, but it's an important piece, that part of the Bush administration's catering to multinational corporations was to fail to enforce the trade laws that we have in place or the provisions in our trade agreements for the last 8 years. We haven't enforced the labor provisions in the generalized system of preferences or the trade agreements that we've signed. And we certainly haven't enforced our trade laws against unfair trade practices because the Bush administration has a view that cheap imports are good for consumers, and they've sort of missed the point that the reason we have trade laws is to protect the producers from unfair practices. And the most important piece of the enforcement agenda is China. We have a $256 billion trade deficit with China. It is more than half of our non-oil goods deficit is with one country. And it's a 5-to-1 imbalance between our imports and our exports. That is an extraordinarily lopsided trade relationship with one country. And our trade deficit is actually coming down with a lot of parts of the world, a lot of regions. But it's going up with China, and it's going up because of the price of oil. So there's two parts of our trade deficit that are moving in the wrong direction, the oil piece and the China piece. And so cracking down on the unfair trade practices of the Chinese government, particularly currency manipulation, as Andy mentioned, worker rights violations, and subsidies, would go a long way towards addressing some of the big trade deficit problems. In new and pending FTAs, I'm totally out of time, so I'm just going to say quickly that we have a bunch of old FTAs, the Colombia, Korea, and Panama FTAs that are kind of hanging out there and probably need to be revisited before they get brought to a vote, but they each have their own set of issues, and we can talk about it in the question and answer. There are other issues within the FTAs besides labor and environment, besides the stronger labor and environment provisions, which are an important, obviously very important to us, and it's been something we've fought about for a long time, is to have enforceable core worker rights included in all of our trade agreements. But also the investment provisions, the intellectual property rights, government procurement, services, and agriculture are other parts of the trade template, the FTA template, that do need to be addressed. And we hope, and as Andy said, in those questionnaires, those very detailed questionnaires, we do have commitments from the candidate to address some of those, as well as in the Democratic platform. So that's an important question. It's going to be one that's going to require some pressure on the new administration to go back and revisit those issues. I think we have an opportunity to redesign our unilateral preference programs. Those are the trade preferences we give to developing countries through the Generalized System of Preferences, the Andean Pact, the Caribbean Basin, and the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And we have a whole kind of messy patchwork of unilateral preference agreements, different worker rights conditionality in each one of those. Those could be done much better. They could be done in a much more coherent way, and in principle could be done in some partnership with developing country governments to figure out how to make them more useful as a development tool rather than just a market access bill. And the multilateral piece is the hardest piece. It's one where we have the Doha round kind of hanging out there at the World Trade Organization. It's maybe half negotiated, but has consistently failed over the last 6 years for the negotiators in Geneva to reach any kind of consensus on moving that forward. I think this is a very perilous piece for a next administration because the talks aren't going well, but the talks were launched, in our view, on a basis which is very anti-worker and anti-development and anti-environment for that matter as well. Most of the most important issues that the multilateral trading system can and should be talking about aren't even on the table. And yet what is on the table is very deep tariff cuts, industrial tariff cuts, as well as changes in the agricultural policy. This is a dangerous moment, and one that's going to be very hard because everybody, in principle, likes the idea of multilateral trade rules. I like the idea of multilateral trade rules in principle, but you have to be able to talk about the issues that are important. I think climate change, worker rights, currency manipulation, and tax differences aren't on the table. I don't know how you have a multilateral set of trading rules that don't talk about those important things. Those are crucial for the United States in particular, especially since we are under a lot of pressure to take our industrial tariffs way down, to make deep cuts in our industrial tariffs where we have a few tariff peaks, but without getting the progress on worker rights or currency or climate change. That could be a very, very dangerous moment for us. So I'm just going to flag that as something that we need to keep a lot of attention on. But look forward to a new administration and a new Congress that can take the domestic issues and the international issues and address them in a way that really begins to make sense. But that's going to be a heavy lift. Over to you, Sarah.
Okay. Great. Well, I want to say that, as John mentioned, I have been working on these issues since the NAFTA debate, and because of that, I can really fully appreciate how much of a shift there has been on trade policy. And I would say that my two fellow panelists deserve a lot of credit for that. With Andy out there building the grassroots base, and Thea here in Washington really going, toe-to-toe with people at the Business Roundtable and USTR and making their jobs a lot less pleasant, I think, over the years. I really appreciate all their work. And I do want to go back to these questionnaires that Andy and his gang made use of so successfully during the primary season. He said that they really got into the weeds, and I'm someone who loves the weeds. I love getting down into the fine print of these deals because I think it is so critical. And I was so excited when the Iowa questionnaire came out to see the very strong statement that Obama made on the investment rules, because that's an issue that I care deeply about, and so I'm going to talk a bunch about that today because it also has a direct link to the financial crisis. And so just to explain what's in these investment rules, which are in our agreements from NAFTA and all the other bilateral and regional trade agreements that we've been signing over the years, I find them to be completely anti-democratic and probably the most extreme example you can find of excessive powers given to corporations in these trade agreements. And as I said, I'm going to explain how they've been part of this financial deregulation push around the globe, and how we're going to need to change these things if we're going to be serious about preventing future financial crises. So basically what these investment rules do is they give corporations and also private individual investors the right to sue governments in these international tribunals. And they can sue over a wide range of government actions that they claim will reduce their profits. And the kind of things that you probably heard of have been environmental or public health actions. For example, a Canadian company is suing the U.S. right now over a California law designed to limit the environmental damage caused by a gold mining project there. But they can also sue governments if they impose controls on capital flows. And so to me, that's the direct link here with the financial crisis. So why is that a big deal, to ban countries from using capital controls? It's a big deal because many countries have used capital controls effectively to protect themselves from the kind of crisis that we're in right now. 10 years ago, when there was the global financial crisis that started in Asia, countries like Malaysia, Chile, India, China, others used these controls to weather that crisis more effectively than many other countries that were hit. And so what do I mean by capital controls? They can vary a lot in how they're implemented. For example, just take Chile and Malaysia. Chile for a long time had a law that allowed the government to require that if a foreign investor is going to put money into the country, they also had to put a deposit in the central bank for a certain length of time. If they kept their money there for that amount of time, they'd get the deposit back. If they withdrew it earlier, they would lose it. So in a way, it was sort of a tax on hot money flowing in and out of the country. They were trying to encourage more long-term, stable investments. With Malaysia, it was quite different. They, during the financial crisis, were really getting clobbered by currency speculators that were gambling against the Malaysian currency. And so they just went wham. Nobody's going to take no foreign investors are going to take their money out of our country for a year. They just put an absolute halt on it. And what's interesting is in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, even the IMF changed their position on capital controls. For years and years, they had been on this crusade to just wipe, capital controls off the face of the earth. And after seeing how some countries use them effectively to get through that crisis, they actually put out a report admitting that and reversing their position. Before they'd had just a blanket opposition to them. They admitted that for some countries in certain circumstances, they were a useful tool to have. I remember, though, that I talked maybe 5 or 6 years ago with Vice President at the IMF, and I said, congratulated them on reversing this position after all of these years. And I said, but hey, did you know that the U.S. government is still insisting that there be a ban on capital controls in their trade agreements that they negotiate with other countries? And kind of went, really? Like he was shocked, and you could tell he kind of felt like, wow, I'm kind of enlightened compared to these Neanderthals over at USTR and the U.S. Treasury that all these years have kept insisting on putting a ban on capital controls in these agreements. And so will this be a big issue in this current financial crisis? It's maybe a little early to tell, but not that early. Over the past week, we've been reading reports about massive capital flight out of emerging markets, governments scrambling to try to prop up the value of their currency. Manuel, my colleague from Mexico here, and I have been studying how the Mexican peso has devalued by 20% this month. His government has had to put 13% of their reserves in to try to buy up the peso and prop it up. To no success yet. Brazil, same thing. They spent $16 billion trying to prop up the value of their currency. Russia, Pakistan, Eastern European countries, Chile, again. So this is a tool that some of these governments have and can use. It's not the only tool. You can try to raise interest rates. As I said, you can also use your reserves to try to pop it up. But this is an important tool that has worked in the past to protect countries from the ravages of crisis. I mean, think about it. 10 years ago, 27 million people lost their jobs in 5 Asian countries alone. The ILO now is predicting 20 million job losses globally as a result of this crisis. So this is not good news for workers anywhere to have that kind of spike in unemployment that's just going to contribute to this brutal competition over jobs that undermines workers here and everywhere. And so I find it just insane that that tool has been taken away from so many governments when even, for God's sake, even the IMF has changed their tune on this. And I'm hoping that we can use what should be such an embarrassing thing in these trade agreements as one more lever to open them up, to renegotiate them. We know it's not the only complaint we have about these deals, but that should be an easy one to go after. I just want to end with one final point, which is I think both of the other speakers realize that our concerns about these trade agreements, our response to that shouldn't be to just tinker with the rules in these trade agreements. We do need this broad new development agenda aimed at reducing inequalities here and abroad, supporting sustainable development. There needs to be a big conversation about what that development agenda should look like. But I think one piece of it needs to be debt cancellation for the poorest countries. It's been shown to be one of the most effective forms of aid. There's a lot of momentum behind this issue, important precedent set under the Bush administration, but more progress now with a bill called the Jubilee Act that would cancel the debts for a couple dozen additional countries without tying it to the onerous policy conditions that the World Bank and the IMF have put on previous debt cancellations. This bill has passed the House. It's passed the Senate Finance Committee. Senator Obama is a co-sponsor of it and has been speaking out in favor of it on the campaign trail. And so I'm just hoping that, in this crisis when there's so much of a tendency to look internally and just look at your own pocketbook, that we remember that we are all part of the same world here. Our lives are connected to those in other countries, and we need to not just have a U.S. domestic stimulus package, but think about a stimulus package globally. If we don't, I am really concerned about the kind of brutal, job competition that we're going to see even, intensified as a result of this crisis. Thanks.
Great. Well, we're going to open it up now to questions, but just I'm curious, Sarah, for you to end. You started with the story of the Iowa questionnaire. So Barack Obama's response on investment rules is?
Right. He said that he would strictly limit the authority of corporations to use these rules to sue governments. And we need to flesh that out a bit more, but that was a really big step forward.
And in fairness, Global Trade Watch, some of their volunteers went out and did the Iowa one. And then we kind of picked up that baton and ran with it in some of these other states. But we asked a variation of that question in every state and got a very similar variation of his answer in every state, basically saying we're not You know, we're going to roll these back. And and he wrote a letter specifically for Wisconsin, which is on our website, in a whole paragraph, offering a lot more of his commitments than we asked, and volunteered, like, I understand this issue, this is a major problem, and went on to talk about why they view it as a problem. So.
He didn't go so far into the weeds as to say no more bans on capital controls, but that's a goal for the future.
Okay, so I know there's a lot of people here who work on these issues too, and some of you don't. So
Go first.
then,
Okay.
and maybe with Segundo, give your top one thing you want about it.
From Latin America, because that's what
Okay, good.
Latin America.
in terms of trade in Latin America.
Okay. You know, in terms of trade, one of the things we're hoping is that trade will not be very high on President Obama's agenda the first year or two. There's so much to be done in terms of the Employee Free Choice Act, healthcare reform, and getting the economy back on track. Other than, you know, enforcing the China trade issues a whole lot better than has been done, there's not a lot of an offensive agenda. I mean, the whole concept is to remake the attitude towards trade, which is trying to sort of figure out how we can use the labor and environment provisions more effectively to empower workers and to protect the environment. You know, I think redoing the unilateral preference program would be one way of trying to change the focus. And if you take the focus of our trade policy is just so irritating, you know, that it's all about market access, as though that is development and that is the poverty program. And so obviously that isn't the poverty program. I think with Latin America, immigration is going to be a really important piece of how we talk to Latin America about what's going forward. And if you tie immigration to trade policy, the whole idea is that rather than sort of wrecking your economy so that your workers have no choice but to come to the United States and look for a decent job, we want to be able to fix what's wrong there and really come down on it. So that was a long answer. Todd, in terms of your question, the AFL-CIO is spending $53 million, but our unions are spending $200 million. So it's a lot of money. We have about 250,000 volunteers. We're knocking on hundreds of thousands of doors a day, and including our Working America program, which is a really important piece of what the AFL-CIO is doing. This is our way of reaching out to workers who don't have the benefit of a union at the workplace, but agree with the basic policy positions that we've taken. So we have canvases of doors, of people knocking on doors in battleground states at the rate of more than 100,000 a week. I think we're gaining new members for Working America. We have 2.5 million members of Working America. And so all those pieces, it is actually a really extraordinary program, and it's very exciting too, because when we identify swing voters, people who are undecided still, they get anywhere between 6 and 25 contacts from the labor movement. And a lot of these voters are the folks who are what we call hard to reach or hard to persuade demographics, old white guys, and older white married women who have, or gun owners, vets, retirees that have been very hard to talk to, and they're hard to talk to for a lot of reasons this year. But our program has really made a difference in the key states where we're working. Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Minnesota is where the bulk of our resources are. And we've really been able to move folks pretty dramatically to the point where, Obama is actually behind among white men nationally, but he's got a 20-point lead with white union men in the battleground states. So it's a pretty impressive program that's out there. And in terms of the other races, we're playing in about a dozen Senate races. We think we are within shouting distance of the magic number of 9 Senate votes that would put the Democrats, give us a filibuster-proof majority to pass things like the Employee Free Choice Act and health care reform without having to deal with that. And then there are, I think there's 75 House races, and they keep adding another 1 or 2 every day or every week that come into play. So it's kind of extraordinary what's going on. And so overall, it's more than 500 races, looking at the state legislature as well as the House and Senate. But it's a pretty impressive program.
Andy.
Just quickly, before wearing this hat, I was state fed president of AFT Wisconsin in the AFL-CIO umbrella, and love wearing that badge. And it was easy to transition into working on trade issues from that position because since 1992, a lot of these AFL-CIO members that don't necessarily consider themselves as strong unionists, but they're part of it and they've been educated about this issue. And to answer your question, what I want President Obama to do, and I always get a little comfortable counting all of our chickens right now. It's a little too early to do that.
It's too early.
But if we have a President Obama, I would like him to just keep his promises. I would be really ecstatic if he just reread the questionnaires and said, I did that, and kept them. That would be great. If I dare to dream, I would love to see some political insight of going, wow, we picked up all of these seats in the House, we picked up seats in the Senate, we're in control, and we're in control in a way that you haven't seen for decades. They're going to come after us really hard in 2010. What do we need to do across the board and get it done now, knowing that this may be our only opportunity, but then also sell it? So I'd like to see him make a template of not what can we get away with at the minimum for a trade agreement, but let's find a country that wants to trade with us, and let's do the model. And let's look at something like the Trade Act, and let's look at some of the other groups and bring people together and say, what does it mean to have a real trade agreement that everybody on the left can be for, and that everybody can embrace and get behind? And let's pass it and call that the template.
New Zealand.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be...
They really want a trade agreement.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to take on negotiating the trade agreement with China in the first step. But if you were to put something together that made sense and say, look, we've done it, we can do that, this is what we can all get behind, that would be a great step forward.
I like that idea, and I would point also to the Bolivian government, which submitted guidelines for a U.S.-Bolivia trade agreement that don't look all that different from the Trade Act, and so there's something to start with there. But I think my advice would be for Obama's first step would be to follow through on his promise to renegotiate NAFTA. This is the agreement that's been the blueprint for many others, and the situation in Mexico is really dire. The IMF released their economic forecast a couple of weeks ago, and the large developing country that is expected to be hardest hit by the crisis is Mexico, and it is completely a result of their dependence on the U.S. economy, largely, the result of NAFTA, and really, throwing their hat with the U.S. economy. And it is frightening. Already there has been a crisis in the countryside of farmers really losing their livelihoods because of this, reckless competition with heavily subsidized producers here, so that the agriculture provisions of NAFTA clearly need to be looked at again. The labor and environmental side agreements to NAFTA are pathetically weak. There's so much there that I think really needs to be almost I mean, that would be another route to go after probably the worst trade agreement and fix that one. That the other way would be to imagine our ideal model. But I think this is, our neighbor is right on our border. It's inescapable that the problems in Mexico are going to boomerang back to affect people here, and if we don't deal with it, it's going to be a mess.
He can come out and say, we're going to do trade agreements that reflect the interest of a majority of the people in our country and in Mexico, and embrace this rather than apologetically say, we're going to try and do something new. There's no reason he shouldn't, whatever politician gets in there, embrace what's the majority view in most of these districts and in most of the country.
Great. Okay, we'll take